Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Angela Lim, medical doctor and co-founder of Clearhead, an innovative employee wellbeing platform. Clear the Air is a podcast covering those experiences in your life or questions you have that you feel too vulnerable to share with those around you, such as, why do I feel so lonely? And what can I do to feel happier? We get real and raw on these existential questions on mental health and well-being that's puzzled humans for millennia, sharing the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. What if leadership wasn't just about authority, decision-making, or overseeing tasks done, but about developing powerful interpersonal relationships to inspire and influence? In this episode, we will explore how relational leadership focuses on cultivating both trust and connection. We'll share practical tips on how to build meaningful relationships and navigate complexity, thus transforming our effectiveness as leaders. Learn how to cultivate leadership that is both empathetic while maintaining a standard of high performance and accountability in your team. Our guest today is an expert in seeing beneath the surface and getting to the heart of the problem, which often in organizations is all about the people and the dynamics they have with each other. Moira Mallon is a certified coach with the International Coaching Federation, and for over 20 years has coached hundreds of leaders, including those leading the Christchurch post-earthquake rebuild. Her coaching is informed by systemic thinking, emotional development, and transformative tools like the Leadership Circle and a practice in Gestalt Psychotherapy. Whether she's coaching CEOs, senior executives, or rising leaders, Moira brings a fierce belief in the power of human potential. Welcome, Moira.
Thank you, Angela. It is just fabulous to be here with you this morning and to be able to focus on such a leadership topic like this that's really at the heart of what I absolutely love to do. So thank you.
Perfect. Well, Moira, could you share with us, how did you even get to become a coach for leaders?
It was a bit of a circuitous journey, Angela, to be honest. Really, I started in change management. And through that journey of change and change projects, I found more and more often I was spending time with leaders and working with them really closely and in a one-on-one capacity, helping them to support their teams in a very culture-focused way and in a way that really focused on the emotional experience of change. And I just loved that opportunity to dive deeper and to work with leaders much more intentionally around their own journey and own experience. And that for me was when I made that commitment to going into leadership development and leadership coaching in particular, going, gosh, there is a huge amount of responsibility that sits on our leaders, particularly in such a complex world. And so that opportunity to really support them meaningfully was a call to action for me. And that's when I made the transition out of change management and change projects into leadership coaching and leadership development.
Amazing. Well, we indeed do live in a very complex world with a lot of change, whether that's the AI disruption, whether that's the economy we're in and the level of restructuring that's happening across the world. Exactly that is what leaders are struggling with. And you talked about two terms in there, emotional experience of the employee and a culture-focused way. What does those two things even mean?
They're connected, Angela, but there's distinctions as well. So often we are under immense pressure as leaders to perform. And we have this kind of innate drive that we need to know everything, that we need to hold it all together. And in doing that, we just create this bubble of strain around us that's really removing that capacity to connect with people. And so when we talk about that emotional journey and the emotional experience with leadership, it is about that capacity and ability to be able to connect with people beyond that drive to be the superhero or the super doer? Do we really know what we're going through and what we're each experiencing individually and collectively in the workplace? That's really what it means to me. And when we can bring a thoughtful and strategic lens around that, that's what enables cultures to really actually thrive under constant pressure and noise, and particularly immense complexity that we're dealing with.
What does relational leadership mean to you, and why do you think it's important in today's world?
To me, relational leadership really means leading from, I would say, connection rather than control. Because again, there is such pressure to deliver, there's such pressure to do, there's such pressure to focus on a constant stream of often firefighting and very reactive dynamics. And so that can create this kind of sense of being able to focus on task and to focus on outputs. But really, relational leadership, it is about connection, and it's about moving away from that need to control. And if I was to capture that succinctly, it's about shifting from the question of how do I get results through people to how can people and results thrive together. And often we're under so much pressure, we tend to focus only on one, but it's that capacity to be with people in the workplace and to move away from that sense of having to hold everything together. So it's absolutely about connection, and it's about empathy, and it's about closeness. And particularly in a world of change and in a world of noise, our nervous systems can become very frazzled, very easy. And part of responding to that nervous system pressure is creating relational connection. It's that stability and that signal of safety that then allows us to move through complexity in a much more straightforward way, doing it together. We can only do it through connection. And that means relational leadership is at the heart of that.
What I'm hearing you say is that there is a tension between a leader prioritizing control over connection. And a lot of times you would say that the sense of control is a sense of safety. How can you help a leader feel a sense of safety through connection instead of control?
It's a really interesting question, Angela. And I think there's a couple of threads to that. So there's the self-awareness thread. So for a leader to make that shift out of control, which has its own safety mechanism around it, it's the self-awareness of where we're at as leaders at any point in time to really notice where our stress response is. Are we in a zone of flight or fight or freeze or fawn or some version thereof? And then from that place of recognition and self-awareness, we can make a different choice. Because often when we're in that very intense stress place as leaders, we're holding these belief systems that we need to be the experts, that we need to be the fixers, that we need to be the problem solvers. And that isn't the case. And it's those beliefs that pull us into some of those control tendencies as leaders. And when we're pulled into control, there's this diametric stretch. We're being pulled away from connection. So to start to make that shift and ease into our own safety as leaders, we first need to recognize and name where we are. And then a very practical way to move out of that stress response is actually slowing down our own breathing and even slowing down our speech, and just being able to pause before we take any action. But it starts first with self-awareness, then a small moment of centering, to then ease into connection through just slower conversation. Angela, that's absolutely what I would recommend.
And not everyone will have done the work to be able to understand where their need of control is coming from. And what you're suggesting is, even if you might not know what's driving your stress response, doesn't mean you can't do anything about it. You can still absolutely do something as simple as, instead of speaking really, really quickly, you can just slow down your speech. And you don't have to know why you are feeling stressed. You can just start by the mechanism, the physical manifestation of your body and how it's behaving, tricking your brain that you are calm. That's why you're slowing down. And so those are things that absolutely can be done, even if you have to still do the deeper work that might take a longer time on why you're feeling stressed, what's triggering your sense of control that sometimes might be connected to things way back in childhood, right?
Oh, absolutely. We all develop different patterns, whether it's an overdrive in terms of that need for control or the need to self-protect to some extent, or that drive to compliance. They're all really intelligent and really helpful stress responses, because we are getting signals from our external environment to say there's some sense of threat here, or there's some familiar experience here for me emotionally or physiologically that I don't really quite like. And so my way to deal with this is to control things. Somehow I need to be on top of absolutely everything. I need to know what everybody is doing. I need to be moving really quickly. There's often that experience of blustering. We're kind of blustering our way through the office or through our home office or whatever environment that we're in. But these patterns are deeply intelligent. So we've maybe had some experience when we were younger or even early days when we were working and things felt a little bit out of control, or decisions were being made around us. And so a way for us to feel safe was to stay on top of things. I really need to drive for things to be absolutely perfect to make sure that I feel and stay safe right now. Or I need to know what everything is that is going on around me, because if I don't have that, I'm going to be dealing with too much uncertainty that might actually get in the way. So we develop very intelligent stress responses when we're younger. And as leaders, particularly as we reach into more change and complexity, we start to bump up against the usefulness of those strategies. And finding ways to move beyond those patterns, it is twofold. It requires deep reflection and really deep work to grow through that. And we also have immense opportunity in the moments to create shifts. Sometimes we don't have to understand why we're experiencing or feeling what we're feeling, but to notice it gives us enough choice to do something there and then. And regularly doing that starts to change that pattern that's so deeply neurobiologically wired in our systems. So there's a lot that we can do in the moment.
You've worked with so many different leaders, hundreds. What have you noticed they often need to shift or let go to lead relationally beyond just the sense of control? What have you seen worked in terms of what they've done? You've talked about letting go of control. You've talked about slowing down your speech and trying to connect with people more meaningfully. What else have you noticed really worked?
I think so much of it is their practice on developing presence. And that's what I always encourage leaders to do, to intentionally make that shift from performance, which is wrapped up with control, into presence, which is wrapped up with relationship. And ways to do that, again, are really being able to pause in the moment before taking action. Because again, when there's that real drive for control, we are often in action. We're often doing. So being able to pause before taking any action is absolutely key. Just one breath can be enough, because often we don't pause to reflect, to choose what we're going to do next. We can be a little bit impulsive. So being able to pause is part of cultivating that presence. Slowing down our movement is another really helpful strategy. So even as we're walking around the office or we're moving between meetings, rather than the very quick sprint down the corridor or around the corner, just slow down, walk that little bit more slowly. Thirdly, slowing down our speech. Often we begin to connect into conversations or start into conversations when we've got that control dynamic. We're often talking quickly. We're leaning a little bit more towards talking at people and giving direction. So being able to slow down in our conversations with those that we're interacting with is really powerful for cultivating presence, because that is very much at the heart of relational leadership. So that's what I always recommend to leaders on this journey. Start with cultivating presence through slowing down and pausing before jumping into action.
And you talked obviously about then the slowing down allows you to build the connection. What does meaningful connection actually mean? You know, that goes beyond the surface, goes beyond, you know, how's your kids, or is that enough?
That's a great starting point. In the context of what we're talking about and what you're highlighting, Angela, there does need to be more than that. And a big part of that is the willingness to ask, you know, two questions. There's the how are you? And then the willingness to really ask that second question of how are you really? And that's the place from which we truly start to build connection, because we're showing an interest in the people that we're leading and the people that we're working alongside, that we care so much more about them than simply the performance or the deliverable or the output. So always leaning into that second question. So it is foundational to have an understanding of what's important to the people that we work with, you know, in terms of their families, their pets, challenges that they're really dealing with at any point in time, hobbies, interests, really key. But in terms of meaningful connection, it's slowing down into conversation where you're asking lots of open questions, but you're truly checking in to see how people are doing. And it's question number 2, how are you really doing? That's when people start to feel heard and they know that they're being seen and they know it isn't a perfunctory conversation, that there's real empathy in there. And that's immensely powerful.
And I'm going to assume that you can't just do this as a once in a year, I check in with you. How often does one need to be doing this?
Oh, look, I think when we're talking about connection, what is key is consistency. And that's consistency on 2 levels. There's the consistency of how do we show up as leaders? Because when that stress response or the control response is quite high, it can lead to that volatility. You know, we've all been there going, whoa, there's just an enormous emotional roller coaster. The day has started really positively and we're in good form. Suddenly at the end of the day, there's just this wave of stress and grumpiness and tension. So if as leaders, we are showing up in quite volatile ways, that is going to be confronting for everybody that we're working with. So there's the consistency in terms of our own emotional capacity to move through the day. And then there's the consistency of those connections, because it's going to be hard to connect with people if they don't see us as being stable and consistent emotionally. It's like, oh my gosh, anger is going to turn up today or anxiety is going to turn up tomorrow. So there's the space that we hold for ourselves, as well as the consistency of that connection, that it's regular. It's like, this is how we do things around here. So every time you're having an interaction, it's coming from that place of presence. And it can seem like a big ask, when there's a lot of timelines that need to be met and things that need to be done and delivered under pressure. But it's consistency of self, and it's consistency of those connections that over time really builds that trust into the culture that then enables people to relax and to move through stress in a much more straightforward way.
Well, I'm going to challenge that in the sense that in a capitalistic world, we get measured on, are we going to meet the deadlines of the projects that we say we're going to meet? We're not going to, as CEOs, be asked, how many employees have you asked about how their family is? So how do you balance that pressure of what we get measured against versus what we have to do?
Yeah. And look, I think you raise what is, I would imagine most of the people listening would experience or have experienced really commonly as part of their leadership, this kind of overdrive into performance. And it's getting to that place of realizing that performance and care are a loop. They work together. So when we feel cared for, we tend to bring so much more into our work, and performance is always going to be boosted. And with that boost in performance comes a lift in our own confidence and our own sense of self. So that balance between the two means we have to bring in clarity and we bring in care, and the two go side by side. And it's built into different structures around how we work together. So it's really important to ensure that you've got kind of set rituals for how you do connect with your team members. And it might be weekly one-on-ones or fortnightly one-on-ones. You have your weekly or your monthly team meetings where there's a ritual check-in at the beginning. That's more of a personal check-in before actually getting into the conversation about where things are at. So it's always ensuring that as part of that focus on what's being done, there's always a focus on how are you actually doing, and simply treating people with respect in day-to-day conversations, providing clarity about why decisions are being made, even if they're tough decisions. If there's clarity around the why, people can take that on in a very different way. And that in and of itself is a real act of care in the moment. So performance and care go hand in hand, but it's about weaving some of that into your leadership systems and into your organizational practices. It's really important.
And, when you talk about doing all of this, it sounds to me fundamentally what you're trying to do is build an environment of trust, that I trust you to take care of me, and that's why I'm taking care of the business. What separates the leaders who are really good at building trust beyond, because I guess you can technically ask the question, and as you said, if you don't really care about the answer, people will sense that. So what have you seen worked in terms of leaders building trust?
Leaders who build trust and do it consistently have a focus on empathy. And that really means empathy in terms of cognitive empathy, emotional empathy, but also empathic action is really important. So they have that ability to hold high standards and hold people to those high standards, but ensuring that they've got the support and the systems and the resources to help those individuals to meet those standards. And it's the consistency with the connection that they have with staff members is really important, because often what gets in the way of being able to build that trust as leaders is sometimes kind of hiding behind process can very much get in the way of being able to do that. And there's also a really strong element of kind of focusing on too much doing at a point in time, that really everything is about being able to deliver an outcome, and that's the only thing that is important at a point in time. But it's often the hiding behind process, and also an overemphasis on the amount that needs to be done at a point in time. So those who build trust focus on empathy. They focus on coaching conversations because they trust that their staff are capable of working their way through their own problems and challenges. And that's something that's innate in all of us. So to have that ease and to have that focus on, as a leader, I've set the direction, I've set the standard, I'm confident that we've got tools and resources, and I'm going to coach my staff to find a way through to what they need to achieve and what they need to do. And that's absolutely fundamental to that whole focus on trust. It really is. And the consistency.
One of the things that you've mentioned around consistency is, as you said, how the leader is showing up. And, are you going to get anger today? Are you going to get overwhelmed CEO today? Are you going to get stressed out CEO today? But at the same time, we talk about, reducing the stigma that people's mental health can be affected, especially in such high pressure environments. What does authentic leadership look like without having to pretend and be this consistently calm CEO, which I feel it's not realistic sometimes?
Yeah, definitely. And I think something that we miss in the high pressure, high performance environment is that we don't talk about it enough. I think there can be a sense that being resilient means toughing it out and kind of pushing through things. But actually, we've got to create steadiness through acknowledging the pressure and actually talking about it and really naming it to then find a way through it. So often we kind of try and push the lid down on it, going, right, let's just buckle up and brace for impact and push our way through. But in fact, the most effective way to deal with that is naming the pressure and creating space to have conversation around that, to then discern, right, where are we at and how do we move through it? So it needs to be part and parcel of the conversation, as opposed to simply accepted as something that's there and everybody's finding their own way to either dance around it or push through it, and saying, actually, let's talk about this together in terms of where our pressure points are, and acknowledging that there is a massive amount of pressure on leaders and all of us in the workplace. And we need to be able to speak to that. And it's also that the real sense of appreciation that everybody is coming with good intent. And if we bump into some of those real challenges, that we're jumping out of our zone of calm, that we can just talk about that afterwards, or that we can apologize if we've perhaps in some way upset somebody through the course of a conversation in that regard. But just being able to name what's going on, going, right, there's a real pressure point and this is how we need to deal with this. But it's not the right thing to do, to bypass it or to ignore it. It's got to be front and center of any high trust, high performing team.
Some of our listeners that would be listening to what you've just said and agree with all the approaches of this is how someone should lead. They, however, might not be in a leadership position, but might be working under leaders that they hope would pick up some of what you've just said. How can you suggest people influence up around this side of things, especially if they don't have the leaders don't have the self-awareness of how they're coming across? Yeah,
and that can often be a dynamic that happens in organizations that can lead to people feeling a little stuck. And again, it's that unsteadiness. The nervous system can start to go into high alert, going, whoa, I'm feeling this pressure, or I'm having this experience. I'm not noticing that wonderful support coming from my own leader, or I'm not too sure that they're aware. And in terms of influencing up, again, I would say to anybody experiencing that for themselves, to tune in, just really notice where you're at and what's going on for yourself, and steady yourself, and being able to step into that conversation with your leader. Again, embracing it more as a coaching conversation, and being able to frame it in terms of, this is what I'm noticing, or this is what I'm experiencing, and being able to put some suggestions forward in terms of ideas that might either improve a dynamic for the team, or an opportunity to perhaps reframe or reconsider a timeline, but being able to name it from your own experience, going, this is what I'm noticing for me, or this is what I'm noticing or observing generally, and this is what I would suggest. Is this something that we can speak through? So I think engaging in question-oriented dialogue is a really useful way to be able to influence upwards. So when you're owning your own experience and really understanding what's going on, then think about what might make a difference, and just begin to cultivate and lean into those conversations with your leaders. Because most leaders, when there's enough space in the conversation and openness, are always willing to slow down. I think it's so often just the habit of having quite transactional discussions at work, given the pressure that we're under. But so often we have much more influence than we realize if we take the time to prepare for those conversations with our leaders and bring in that positive intent. It can be really helpful in opening up opportunities to bring in new ideas for dealing with stress and pressure.
And I do believe that, most leaders want to be in a position where they are doing what's right for their people. And often they can find themselves surrounded by yes men or yes people, so they don't actually get what they need in terms of feedback to improve. So any feedback is always going to be seen as a gift if it's by the right leader who is at least open-minded enough to change. So definitely take the approach Moira is suggesting, and don't feel stuck with, I have a terrible leader. And sometimes it might just be that this leader just does not have the self-awareness, but your conversation with them might be what sparks the change. I think just taking a bit of a change of tack, you talked a little bit about transactional interactions. And now that we've moved into much more of a hybrid, or for some companies, a fully remote way of working, it can be much easier to fall into a trap of transactional interactions, of you're just messaging online about things to do. You don't have the sort of space, I guess, to have the more meaningful conversation. What is your advice on how leaders can create real connection and trust when you don't see people in person?
Yeah, and I think, Angela, that it can work differently as well in terms of hybrid and in terms of fully remote working. And generally in a hybrid dynamic, it can be even more challenging, even though there are often touch points for team members and leaders seeing each other more regularly, but it can create a whole different dynamic. So when we're not together all the time, where those casual conversations can occur, we need to build in intentionality into our remote dynamics. And that can look like, again, at the beginning of meetings, really having a check-in before getting into the agenda, before getting focused on the deliverables and the outputs, having that much more either a playful or personal check-in to see how people are doing is a really straightforward way to do that. But what's often more impactful and more helpful is actually the phone call. I think when we're working remotely, we're so used to the kind of marathon Zoom or Teams sessions that we miss the opportunity for more informal intimacy. So I would be saying to leaders, pick up the phone and ring your team members, even for just a 5-minute chat, just very casual check-in. That can just add a whole different dynamic into the conversation, because it's essentially the remote equivalent of the water cooler conversation. But it's really important to have those small, intimate opportunities for interaction that aren't part of a structured meeting. They're not part of a structured forum. It's just that one-to-one check-in on the phone that's away from the screen and creates an opportunity to just have a really present and heart-to-heart conversation. We often don't do enough of that in our hybrid and remote working experiences.
Often via text or messaging, you just lose a lot of the nuance, the tone, and maybe someone who's receiving your message is stressed. And so they read your tone as stress, even though that might not be your tone. And so picking up the phone really negates a lot of that misinterpretation that often can happen. You know, I think when you have those conversations, it might make you have a sense that there is something more underneath the surface. How can leaders be more attuned to the emotional needs that might be hiding behind performance issues or, you know, dysfunctional conversations or team dynamics that you notice as a leader, either through direct conversation with the individual or conversations when other people come to you asking for help about what they're seeing?
Yeah, because, you know, so often we're moving through our conversations at pace. You know, we've all been there, and we experience them at some point every day. And moving beyond that is so often tuning in to what you're not really hearing, and just noticing tone of voice, never mind words. Or if you are with somebody either, you know, on the screen or in person, just noticing their body language as well, and being able to share some of that back creates an opportunity to go below the surface. Going, how are you really feeling about this? What's really on your mind about this situation? So if you can see that there's a little bit of a disconnect, perhaps between what they're saying through their words and their tone and body language, that's the opportunity to pause and just go below that surface a little bit more and really tune in to what you're not hearing. And it requires that real grounding initially before entering into some of these conversations. So just tuning into yourself, seeing where you are at, to make sure you're in that position to be really present to your team members, and then go below the surface always. Just reach in beyond the words, and there's always gold. There's always an insight. So often our own team members don't even notice that they're perhaps holding a concern or holding an idea or holding a point of stress until it can be mirrored back and essentially welcomed into the conversation. But look beyond the words, and explore really openly.
One of the things that you mentioned right at the start is about building great culture as part of this approach. How do you define great culture, and how do you know, that this is the right thing to do?
I think there's really, a few pillars around great culture, and one of them is clarity. That's a fundamental starting point. So is everybody absolutely clear on what's expected of them and why that's expected of them? Because it can be one thing to understand our own role, but we need to understand the roles of everybody around us that we're interacting with. So absolute clarity, understanding expectations and why those expectations are there. Another pillar is it's that care piece that we've been talking about. How do we show care for each other? That we care that people are set up well to be able to do their jobs and to perform, because that is so important. And are we caring in such a way that it's also more than how people are performing and what they're doing? So care is fundamental to having a really high performing, high trust culture. And then again, and we've spoken about it already, Angela, that consistency piece is key. So are we consistent with our rituals and our rhythms around all parts of people and performance? And as a leader, am I showing up consistently in whatever I am choosing to hold as my purpose as a leader in this role? So it's really that clarity and that care and that consistency. And if leaders can model that, and if they can cultivate that deliberately, it creates that kind of nervous system safety for everybody to be able to play fully in their roles, knowing that if things don't go well, it's okay. There's enough care there within the culture for the learning to be supported. There's enough consistency that there is focus on lessons learned. Really, really key. So I think being able to focus on those things, but it's how you model them as a leader. How can you ensure there's clarity? How can you ensure that there's a level of care and a level of consistency? And that really helps build that type of culture.
Can I stress test this a little? So let's say we talk about Elon Musk and Tesla. He's set this consistency that, okay, you need to work 12 to 16 hour days every day. And because we're launching rockets to the space, and, if you need help, you can ask for it. But, I'm modeling it as a leader and everyone else is modeling it as a leader. So there's that consistency piece. So does that make it a great culture? Because there's clear expectation, there is care when it's needed, and there's consistency in how everybody's meeting that expectation.
Yeah. I love that you're putting that out there, Angela. And there's no yes, no. This is the beautiful nuance with culture. Some people are going to absolutely thrive within that type of consistency. And this is a thing that we have to be really clear about what that means in an environment. So it's not about setting a particular expectation as to what and how everything needs to be done every day, because that's just going to stifle creativity and that's just going to stifle the capacity for connection. So consistency, again, it's much more about our emotional consistency, about how we show up and how we interact, and are we bringing in consistency into our organization from an integrity point of view, that we are doing what we say we are going to do. And that doesn't mean that we can't change things, because things are going to keep evolving, but it's the communication around that is really, really key. It's really key. So there's massive nuance to all of this, which is where it's got to be part of a shared conversation as a leadership team, really anchoring into these pillars of culture. But for you as an individual leader, it gives you enormous empowerment to be able to make choices about how you want to positively influence culture around you, even if there are elements of it that you're not completely connected with. Going back to what you were saying earlier, if somebody is sensing that their own team lead isn't necessarily providing that level of support, going, gosh, what can I do? So this is about what is my own personal capacity to positively influence culture through how I'm showing up in terms of providing clarity, providing a level of care to those around me that are in my own circle of influence here, or my own little island of sanity, and how do I be consistent, even if there's a lot of inconsistency around us? So we all have this amazing opportunity to nudge the dial in some shape or form. And then it can reach into a whole different dynamic of, actually, maybe the values here are not in line with my own values and who I am. And I can't provide that level of consistency and care and clarity that I want to in this place and space. And that's a whole different choice point. But it's knowing for us, going as an individual leader, what can I do within this environment and for myself and for my team right now? And how far can I go with this? So we have to have our own starting point as leaders, no matter the culture or the environment that we're in.
And what I'm hearing from you is communication then is key around maintaining that consistency, even in complexity and change. So what is the right balance around that communication piece? If you kind of communicate things too early, you might cause more uncertainty. But if you communicate too late, people might feel that they've been excluded, or they were a second thought, or things were just being done to them. So what's the right balance to help people feel safe, feel consistency, but in how you communicate and when you communicate?
And again, it really depends on the context of the situation, Angela. Generally, it is always better to lean more towards like over communicating if you're trying to strike the balance there. Because again, as humans, we all need and strive for certainty. That's why complexity can feel so uncomfortable, because our brains are always reaching for certainty in some shape or form. So the more that we can be consistent with that communication. Now, it's about the emotional tone that can come into that as well. So it's all about being able to frame up the broader context of what the communication is for. But if you're in a situation where there genuinely is no particular update on progress around a situation, you can say that, and you can set the expectation as to when there might actually be meaningful, useful information. But the more important thing is just through that process of communication, checking in to see how your team are doing. And just checking in whether they've actually got particular questions. So rather than it being the trickle down approach to communication through change that often happens, actually being able to just check in with your team, going, where are you at with things? Have you got any questions? How are you feeling? What's on your mind? So then you can tailor your response along the way, depending on how the situation is actually unfolding. You know, whether it's a structured project that's being rolled out with very specific timelines, or you're dealing with much more strategic, ambiguous communication. It's quite different. But the key thing is actually just checking in with your team regularly and allowing that to also guide your communication strategy and approach.
Have you ever thought much about the role of Aboriginal or indigenous practices in the context of relational leadership that you could share? Totally understand if you don't.
Oh, look, absolutely. And I think here in New Zealand, we've got just a wonderful, wonderful space for this. And I think it's absolutely beautiful in terms of the way in which we can weave in and learn so much wisdom from te reo and Maori practices, and the opportunity that is there to shift the whole leadership focus through those indigenous practices from the real me to the we focus. And certainly what I've learned through my time working here in New Zealand is again, a little bit like we spoke about earlier, but that when we come together and connect, we're not jumping straight in to talk about the work. We come together and we sit around the table and connect with each other. And developing those practices, and whether it's a karakia at the beginning of a meeting and at the end of meetings, it just creates an openness that otherwise wouldn't be there when we jump straight into the work that needs to be done. And so that opportunity for us to learn about true connection and true humanity and weaving in the wisdom into practice day to day in organizations, I think is something that we need to give more and more time and attention to.
I think there's also increasing complexity around where to draw those boundaries at work. When you talk about not just sticking to talking about work, for some people, they might find that invasive or a little bit, too personal, and they want to keep their personal life out of work, and they don't want you asking about their kids or their dog or their hobbies. Like, how do you know how to draw that line?
And that is about building that relationship with each member of your team. You know, over time, as you build those relationships and you get to know people, there's an understanding there, and not everybody is going to step into a work environment whereby work is the most important thing for them. It's a way for them to support other elements of life. And equally, there are many people who are highly successful and satisfied at work, and they're not necessarily going to step into leadership spaces. So it's through the ongoing conversations as leaders, as we get to know our team members, that we can really sense into what it is that people want to share and what it is that they don't want to share in the workplace. And that's absolutely fine. And part of it is ensuring that as we are inducting our new team members, that we're weaving in all of these different rituals and rhythms that they're aware of, so they can make those choices. And for some people, they may have been in other work environments where there may not have been any opportunity to really connect beyond the work, and it can take time to do that. But as leaders, it's about tuning into that with each individual member of our teams.
Well, maybe as a final question around all of this, what are the skills and practices that you haven't talked about that you like our listeners to know, to help them encourage leaders to become a present leader that can lead from a relational approach? Less about performance and more about connection.
Embrace empathy is what I would encourage everybody to do. And that doesn't simply mean thinking about being in somebody else's shoes. It's that deeper emotional connection around that, and then taking really empathic action, but a commitment to practicing empathy. And anybody who is thinking about this as a new pathway or a new leadership experience and journey that they want to go on to be more intentional with relational leadership, I would say start it in the next conversation. It happens conversation by conversation. So choose your conversations as the place to start. So again, tune into yourself, that self-awareness, steadying of yourself so you can be present, and tune in to conversations in a new way with deep curiosity. And that is the starting point for truly relational leadership, Angela.
That's amazing. Yeah, and obviously all of what we've talked about is very hard to do. So we're not saying it's easy. It's easy to say, or simple to say, but not easy to do. And of course, if you're a leader experiencing this and you want a little bit more help, it's not weakness to to be able to reach out for more support, whether that's through a coaching approach or whether that's, getting some professional help if you're feeling burnt out or stressed or, or the load has led to mental health challenges for you, both at home or at work, Clearhead's an EAP that is able to provide that support. And that's something that you should consider. Well, we love to finish these things off with one simple question, Moira. What is your one well-being practice to stay well?
One well-being practice for me is exercise, going to the gym. For me, that's so important, but it's not just from the physical exercise. It's also the connection. It's also the interaction and the support. And that for me is really key. And I love that, just a warm smile or a conversation or a bit of encouragement from somebody or giving encouragement to somebody at the gym. It's just fantastic, physically, mentally, and emotionally. But if I think in terms of our conversation today and relational leadership, for me, in terms of what has worked really well is embracing the pause. Always, sometimes 30 seconds is enough to settle my nervous system down and to choose more wisely, which is certainly something that often in the past I wasn't doing. I was rushing into action. So absolutely for me, it's embracing the pause.
That's it for today's episode. If you want to learn more about how Clearhead can support your workplace, or you have a burning mental health question that you'd like us to explore on the podcast, check us out at myclearhead.com and drop us a message. Love our content? Share it with a friend or leave us a comment on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook. Thank you so much again for listening and catch you on the next one.